Welcome to Module 2 of Managerial Economics. So this week we're going to be moving from the big picture of macroeconomics to focus more on microeconomics, which is about consumer and producer decisions and how they play out in markets. And a big question for us in this class is how do markets work and how should firms make decisions within those markets? Last week we talked about, in our reading reflection, the purpose of a business. And for all intents and purposes, this book assumes that the purpose of a business is to maximize profits. Now, we might take issue with that potentially, depending on your view of that and how we see profits being pursued. Ideally, we'd like to pursue profits in a way that ultimately honors God and honors other people, in a way that creates value for customers, for our workers, and for everyone involved. But profits are, first of all, kind of like the air we breathe as a business. Without profits, you can't really get anywhere. You can't be sustainable. And also, profits are an imperfect but still useful signal of value creation, when you can take something and turn it into something better, such that the costs of your business enterprise are exceeded by the benefits shown by what someone's willing to pay for the product at the end of the day. And so this week we want to look at market fundamentals. We'll look at chapters 1 through 3 in our main book. Here's our learning objectives for this week. So first of all, we want to analyze the role of microeconomics in industrial organization and managerial decision making, and differentiate between economic and accounting profit as they relate to firm value. So we want to talk about economic profit and why that's what we're trying to maximize as a firm. Then we want to explain the relationship between supply and demand and look at factors that affect market equilibrium. And then we can look at the effects of government interventions like price ceilings and floors. We can come back to other types of government interventions later on in the course. Then we want to apply marginal analysis, which is one of the key tools that I want us to kind of keep in mind throughout the class, which is the idea that when we're thinking about trying to maximize something, whether it's profits or some other goal, and we're trying to consider how much of a certain level of activity is going to get us to that goal. For example, how much should we produce of our product to maximize profits? For any type of question like this, considering how much, the answer is always going to be, we want to pick the quantity where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. That's this marginal analysis idea. And so we can look at, in this goal, how to optimize decisions both in unconstrained and constrained settings by considering all the relevant costs. And then another goal here we'll look at this in our last assignment, is trying to analyze regression models to have some sense of using statistics. This is sort of just an introduction, a little bit of a refresher on some basic statistics, which we can kind of use later when we look at real data and try to analyze things like estimating demand, or trying to use statistics in making business decisions. And then lastly, we'll look at the implications of market structures for firm decisions and the principal agent problem. And as well, we're going to look at a little bit the role that globalization can play in business strategy. So these are our main learning objectives. For our assignments this week, due Thursday, you'll watch this video and answer a quick question. Find a time to meet with your group. And then we have a chapter of this book talking about economics and Christian perspective that sort of talks about the role that markets play in creating value in society and how that relates to other aspects such as like government and society, and how we think about that as Christians. And then after that, we'll look at this reading discussion. For Monday, we'll look at these 3 chapters in our main book, which is the Thomas textbook, which hopefully you've been able to get some form of a copy of. The homework problems are listed in the assignment, so you don't need to worry about getting the exact same problems in the book. They're all listed on Canvas. But this is kind of our focus this week. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the main ideas of these chapters, and then I'll let you guys get after it here. So hopefully the book kind of lays things out in a pretty systematic and clear way. But just to give you a brief idea of where we're going, I'll kind of lay it out here. And then this last assignment is based on chapter 4 of the book. There's just a few exercises kind of looking at how can we use some basic statistics to analyze some data. So this might be a refresher if you've taken some stats before. It might be a little bit new, but this is sort of just laying the groundwork for things we're going to do later on in the class. Okay, in chapter 1, we're looking at managers, profits, and markets. And we have kind of 5 subsections. And looking at the economic way of thinking about business, the big picture goal here is how do we understand markets better so we can make better decisions within markets as managers and owners of businesses. And the economic way of thinking about business is going to be to really think about things through the lens of models. And so a model is just a simplified depiction of reality that focuses on certain features that we find important. So an economic model uses simplifying assumptions about how we're allocating resources, costs, and benefits to focus on what's most important for a given question, such as considering the efficiency of a market or considering what the optimal decision is for a manager of a firm. Next, we want to look at how to measure and maximize economic profit, so we'll differentiate that from accounting profit. The key idea here is that we want to account for all costs, including opportunity costs, even if they're not explicit accounting costs, when we're making our decisions. So how do we measure profit and how do we maximize that? Next, we want to look at one important issue when it comes to managing a firm, which is the fact that there's often this separation between the ownership and the control of the firm. So, for example, you might have a business owner, and they delegate a lot of responsibilities to managers, and managers, they delegate responsibilities to other workers. And so the owner, they have some goals. Maybe their goal is to maximize profits. Managers and workers don't by default have the same goals. The owner wants the managers and the workers to pursue his or her goals, but monitoring might not be perfect. They might have to find ways to incentivize their managers and workers to do things that are in the best interest of the company overall. So that's a big issue that comes up in management, and we call this like a principal-agent problem, where you have a potential misalignment of the interests of the person who's in charge, who owns, and the person who's supposed to be working on behalf of that owner, which could be the manager in this case. And then we'll look at how market structure can play a role in managerial decision making. This is just kind of, in this chapter, giving a rough overview of how managers relate to markets and how they can try to make profits in the context of a market. But there's going to be 4 types of market structures that we'll consider later on in the class. The first one is perfect competition. And that's when we have lots of firms competing, which leads to fairly low profit margins, or essentially normal profit margins. We have monopoly, where you have one firm dominating, and they can tend to get away with higher prices. We have a situation that is probably a realistic depiction of a lot of markets, which is monopolistic competition, and that's when you have a whole bunch of little monopolists, but they're all selling slightly different products that are still somewhat in competition with each other. So it's sort of a maybe more realistic version of perfect competition. And to the extent your product is similar, you have more competition. To the extent your product is really different from other people's products, you have more monopoly power. And then lastly, we have oligopoly, which is going to be the most complicated, where we have these strategic interactions that occur because you have multiple firms, but a few firms kind of dominating a market. And in this case, we have to think really strategically, because what one firm does really impacts what another firm wants to choose. And lastly, we can look at how globalization plays an important role in creating both opportunities and threats for business owners and managers in markets. All right, chapter 2 is sort of an overview of supply and demand. So this is sort of a review of principles of microeconomics type class, but hopefully this will kind of help us nail down some of these things and give us a nice foundation for analyzing things later on in the course. Some of this stuff we might need a bit of a refresher on. Some of it we might be going a little bit deeper than we would have gone in a principles of microeconomics class. And so let's look at briefly the basic idea of each of these things. Hopefully this seems a little bit familiar. But with demand, we're looking at this relationship between price and quantity demanded. So how much are people going to buy of a good depending on the price? So if we look at price and quantity here, we're going to assume that demand curves slope downward. So as the price goes down, people are willing to buy more of a good because it makes it more enticing to buy this good rather than spending their money on other things. All right, demand is going to have a downward slope. Of course, supply tends to have an upward slope. And why is that? We're thinking about this relationship between price and quantity supplied, how much people are willing to sell of a good, depending on what the price is. And sort of the point here is that as the price goes up, producers are willing to go to greater lengths and take on more costs to produce more of a good. And in general, it does get more costly for more of a good to be supplied. As we're producing more and more of it, the marginal cost tends to be going up. For example, with oil, if the price is low, you'll probably find just the cheapest, easiest ways to get some oil, and you're not willing to do more costly things like drill offshore or try to do fracking. But as the price goes up, you're willing to take on more costly ways of trying to accumulate more oil. So you find the easiest ways first, but when the price gets high enough, we're willing to try things like offshore drilling and eventually things that are more complicated like fracking. All right, and then our market equilibrium, the basic idea is we're just looking for this point. What's the price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied? That's going to be our equilibrium price. So we have our demand curve, it slopes downwards. We have our supply curve, it slopes upwards. We have price and our quantity. And so this is going to be our equilibrium. And here we'd call this our equilibrium quantity. And this here would be our equilibrium price. Okay. The next big idea here is how we measure the value of market exchange. And our idea here is about surplus value. So how much do people benefit from market transactions? Well, for a consumer, we look at their surplus, their consumer surplus, which is basically looking at what are you willing to pay minus what do you actually have to pay. Because what you're willing to pay reflects this benefit of an additional unit going to a consumer. And so if we look at supply and demand, this would be our equilibrium price. And so this is the price that the good is being sold at. What we want to look at is this difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a certain unit of good and the price. And we can see that on the demand curve. So we have some person that's willing to pay a lot for this good. That's what they're willing to pay. Someone else, they're not willing to pay as much, so they only buy it when the price falls a little bit more. And the consumer surplus for each unit is this gap between what someone's willing to pay here and what they actually pay based on the equilibrium price. And so this person would have this much consumer surplus, this person would have this much consumer surplus, and so on. And if we add all this up, we could do this for an infinite number of points in between, and we see that this consumer surplus is this area between the demand curve and the equilibrium price. Our producer surplus is going to be not quite the profit of producers in the market, but it's sort of related to that idea. It's more about, I guess, the profit when you're ignoring initial fixed costs. And so the producer surplus is going to be the price the producer receives minus their cost. And so we're going to see that the demand curve shows us the marginal benefit, what someone's willing to pay at each additional unit of the good. The supply curve is going to show us the marginal cost, which is the cost of producing each additional unit. And so the same idea here applies for producer surplus, where we're looking at this difference here. So for an individual transaction, we have the price that they sell at. This supply curve here shows us the marginal cost for the producer, because this shows the minimum price they're willing to accept. And so for this unit sold, this is the price received. This is the cost of producing that unit. And if we add this up, for each unit sold, we look at the price minus the cost of producing that unit. We get this area here, which is the area between the price and the supply curve. And that's going to be our producer surplus. If we add up consumer surplus plus producer surplus, we get overall economic surplus, or we could call this like social surplus, or like a total surplus. And this total surplus, social surplus, is really our measure of the total value created by a market, because every transaction only is going to occur if both sides think it makes them better off, right? The person buying the product values it more than what the price is, and the person producing the product, they're going to only sell it if they can sell it at a price that's greater than their cost. And so this total value created is that sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. All right, once we understand supply and demand, we can look at how things change. That's really the main goal of using supply and demand, is to think about how things change in a market when you have supply side or demand side factors changing. So of course you could look at demand changing, increasing or decreasing. So we want to understand what leads to demand going up or down, what leads to supply going up or down. And we want to clarify kind of in this section the difference between a change in, say, quantity demanded versus an actual shift of the demand curve. So a change in quantity demanded is moving along this demand curve. So as the price goes down, we move along the demand curve and people are willing to buy more. But a shift in demand is when people are willing to buy more or less at every given price, or any given price. So maybe people decide that they like this product more now for some reason, more people want to buy it, and we have this shift in demand. We have a new demand curve here, and you'd see an equilibrium. This price would be going up, and the equilibrium quantity here would also be going up in this case. So we could look at changes in supply and demand. What kinds of things shift demand? Those are things that make people want to buy more or less of the product. What are things that change supply? Things that make it more or less costly for producers to produce. And once we look at changes in supply and demand, we can see how the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity change as we shift supply and demand. And you can see that as we shift demand, we're going to move along the supply curve to the new equilibrium. Consumers are willing to pay more, and as the price the sellers receive goes up, they're willing to produce more product. That's not shifting the supply curve, that's just moving us to a new point on the supply curve as they're getting a higher price and willing to supply more. So that kind of helps us with that distinction there as well. Lastly, we could look at price ceilings and price floors, and we're going to see that these tend to create distortions in markets. They tend to reduce that social surplus that we're just looking at. And so these tend to create inefficiencies in an otherwise efficient market. And so we can draw supply and demand. If this is our equilibrium price, for some reason or another, we could have some motivation for the government to want to raise or lower this price relative to what the market would decide on its own. And so we're going to see that either way, this is going to, whether we try to raise prices or lower prices, that's going to tend to reduce the quantity that's actually gets sold in a market. So for example, if we have a price ceiling, that means we're trying to cap prices. And so if we're trying to cap prices, that must mean we're trying to push prices down. And what's going to happen in this case is we have our quantity demanded goes up. People are willing to buy more at a lower price, but our quantity supplied goes down. People aren't willing to sell as much at this lower price, and that leads to this shortage where we're going to have quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied. And of course, the actual quantity sold is going to be the minimum of the two. A transaction only occurs if there's a buyer and a seller, so we're going to end up at this quantity sold. We're constrained by the supply, and that's going to reduce economic surplus because we lose the value of all these transactions that would have occurred if we allowed ourselves to get to this initial equilibrium quantity. And so we could do the same thing with the floor. The floor is what happens when we're trying to push prices up. In that case, we're now going to be limited by quantity demanded because not as many people are willing to pay for a good at a higher price. All right, and lastly, we could look at marginal analysis, which is really a key thing in economic reasoning, which hopefully will be helpful as you think about managerial decisions. And so we'll think about concepts and terminology like an objective function, what is our goal, and how does it relate to what we're choosing. So for example, we could think about how our quantity produced, that would be like a choice variable, how that relates to our profit. So this would be an objective function because we're looking at our objective, which is profit, and we're looking at how that changes as we change some variable that we can control, like our quantity produced. We want to look at two types of maximization problems where we're trying to maximize some objective like profit. In unconstrained maximization, you can pick any value. So maybe you could pick any quantity to produce. Eventually it'll be more and more costly to produce more, but in theory there's no obvious limit of how much you're allowed to produce in the marketplace. But constrained maximization is when you have to pick from a limited set of values. So maybe you can't pick any quantity, you have to pick a quantity within a certain set. And so this often occurs in the context of a budget. So consumers definitely have a budget, so they're dealing with a constrained maximization problem. They're trying to get as much value as possible from consuming goods under the constraint of only having a limited budget to spend. And to some degree, managers might be in that sort of constrained maximization situation as well when we have budgets. So maybe your boss gives you a budget to spend on something. You're not able to pick any quantity. You're only able to do so much based on a given budget that the firm has or that a certain branch of the firm has. All right, so that's sort of an overview. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea where we're going with this section on trying to think about markets and how that's going to help us think about managerial decisions within those markets. So let me know if you have any questions as you're going. I'm happy to help with homework, or if you have a time that you want to meet with me, you can schedule a time if you click on schedule a meeting on the left side of our campus page, or just feel free to send me an email, and we'll be in touch, and I'll see you next week.